So to begin this project, I used 8/4 walnut. I could have certainly used something a little bit thinner, but that's what I had on hand. First I began milling my boards like normal. I got a flat edge on the joiner, and I got a flat face, also on the joiner. I mirrored my flat edge on the table saw, and I mirrored my flat face on the planer. Now when you're milling lumber, don't worry about taking a lot of material off at once. I recommend taking more passes while taking less material off in each pass. In my opinion, that results in a better cut and a better final product. Next, I started drawing out my layout lines. The tops and bottoms of the legs get a 5-degree angle to create a splay. The leg also tapers from about 2 inches at the top to 1 inch at the bottom. Taking your time to properly measure and lay out your lines is one of the best things you can do to ensure that your final product comes out great. Here I just recommend taking your time, measure, and then measure again. Next I took a miter gauge and my board, and I slowly began to sneak up on my layout lines. Sneaking up on your lines is very important, especially in a piece like this with really subtle angles. It not only allows you to get right up on your line and make really precise cuts, but when you cut wide, if you accidentally have your cut set up 5 degrees the wrong way, for example, it allows you to see this mistake before it actually happens. Next thing I did is take my Rockler tapering jig, and you can buy one of these or you can build one. I'll link to a video description from Fix This Build That of a tapering jig you can build at home. Now as I'm cutting these tapers, I want to talk about just a general woodworking concept, and that's accuracy. You know, my goal here is to go from 2 inches to 1 inch, but those numbers are really arbitrary. What I want is 4 consistent legs. And this also goes when you're cutting things to length. If you're an 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch short on your cut every time, that's okay. You just want to be sure that you're that same amount long or short on your cut every time. In my opinion, consistency on cuts is more important than the accuracy of the cut in woodworking. And finally, be sure you label your pieces really well, especially at this stage. The last thing you want to do is mix anything up. Now you'll see something interesting here. I don't have a dado blade, surprisingly. So I just used my standard blade. It has an 1/8 inch kerf, and it takes a while, but I just clear out the material as if it were a dado blade. And much like those subtle 5-degree angles, I sneak up on my line here, and I actually cut very wide of my line the first time. It's really easy to have your piece turned 5 degrees the wrong way, and cutting wide ensures you have your cut set up properly. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. I thank you guys so much for your support already, especially as a new channel. And your subscriptions and support allows me to keep making content like this. One thing that I highly recommend anytime you're doing a woodworking project is to save a little sawdust after your cuts and after your milling. This will give you a little wiggle room when you do your glue up later and allow you to fix some mistakes. Speaking of the glue up, I went ahead and glued up my half lap joints and got those set up overnight. Once I started the glue up, I realized that I did in fact have a few imperfections and some gaps, and I used that sawdust from earlier to fill those in. The technique here is to fill the gap or crack with a little bit of wood glue, take some of that sawdust you saved, rub it in there, and after it's dried for about 5 minutes, you can come back with some sandpaper and begin to sand it smooth. Next, after it dried, I headed over to my belt sander and started shaping the legs. After I shaped the first one, I essentially used this as a template to have identical corners on the rest of my legs. As a special touch on this, I'm trying a new technique that I've never tried before, and it is cold casting brass. I saw Sean Boyd do this, and I thought it would look really good on this piece. Cold casting metal is essentially an epoxy pour with metal powder mixed in. You can get this metal from most art stores. Finally, I looked over everything and hit it with a heat gun to pop any bubbles and made sure I had an even pour. While that was drying, I went ahead and marked out where I'm going to cut my leather seat. Now I did this in 2 pieces. I did a front and a back. So I cut one piece to size, and I cut a second piece oversized. This allowed me to have a non-stressful glue up when I joined them together, and then I just cut away the excess on the larger piece using a straight edge. Next, I began my leather stitching. First, I struck a chalk line to be sure I could put my punches in straight and use this leather punch tool to punch in on my holes. After that, I got comfy on my couch and sat there for a total of 6 hours, stitching and stitching and stitching. After back stitching this piece, I cut it back, tied it off, and burnt the ends, and desperately tried not to start a fire. You'll see I was unsuccessful. Finally, as a little extra insurance policy, I glued down my knot with some super glue to be sure it wouldn't back itself out or come unraveled. I'm really happy with how the seat turned out, especially since it's my first time ever working with leather. Now that the epoxy is dry, I used some 60 grit sandpaper and a sander to start flattening everything out and being sure it was all level and flush. I did find a few imperfections and had to come back with a second coat of epoxy. I also used a card scrape and a chisel to level everything out. Next thing I wanted to do was add a round over. But before I could do that, I wanted to be sure my legs were completely finished, completely smooth, completely flush. So I took a lot of time with some 60 grit sandpaper and a random orbital sander and leveled everything out, so when I came and did my round over, everything would come out nice and neat. I don't often put round overs on my pieces, but I believe that in this instance, it really made the look of the piece. It completely changed the stool from this angular, kind of very modern design to something soft and inviting, which, is what you want in a piece like this. Next, I wanted to get everything prepared to add my stretchers. I connected these with glue and dowels, and I laid out my lines for my dowel holes. For the leg side, I used a drill press, and for the stretchers themselves, I had no other option but to use just a hand drill. Once I added the dowels, I began final assembly. I took my time, didn't stress about the glue drying, and everything came out great.